Welcome to Better Thinking, a podcast that takes a unique approach to understanding sports betting. I'm your host, John Alesia. Today's episode features Joseph Buchdahl, one of the most respected voices in sports betting analytics. Joseph is the author of several influential books on sports betting and has spent decades analyzing betting markets through a statistical lens. You'll find links to his books and work in the show description. In this conversation, we explore the wisdom of the crowds concept, dive into the psychology behind betting decisions, and uncover crucial insights about market dynamics that every bettor should understand. Joseph brings a data-driven perspective to topics like loss aversion, cognitive biases, and the real challenges of professional betting. Better Thinking isn't your typical sports betting podcast. We bring together diverse voices from psychologists and professors to professional traders, all focused on one goal, helping you become a sharper, more informed bettor. Let's get started with Joseph Buchdahl. Joseph, how are you, man? Thank you for coming on the show.
Good, John. Good, thanks. Yeah.
In doing a little bit of research, and I've read your articles in the past, I've read some of your books. The one thing that's really fascinated me is the wisdom of the crowds and how you've kind of incorporated that into sports betting. I don't know if our listeners and viewers are totally familiar with maybe the book Wisdom of the Crowds, but maybe you could give us a little background on that. I know you wrote a whole study, a PDF that's out there that I'll link down below to that so everyone can read that. But I think there's a lot of interesting things and some interesting takes that we can get out of that.
Yeah. I mean, really, it's a bit of a misnomer. And I kind of try to correct that in the last book. It's really probably should be called Wisdom of the Pinnacle Crowd. And it all started, I guess, with looking for a way of trying to find like a default set of true odds. And we're obviously, those that are like familiar with the betting industry know that the bookmakers like Pinnacle do have some pretty sharp odds a lot of the time.
Let me cut you off for a second. Maybe we should talk about that. Like, why is Pinnacle considered to be a sharp? What is a sharp book, and then what are maybe the square books, so to speak? What are the differences there?
I guess there's two main bookmaking models. There's a sharp bookmaking model, and that's where a brand is looking to set odds that are reflective of the true odds or the true probabilities of things happening. And they are interested in keeping their sharp customers on board. They use them to make their lines and their odds better. And so in contrast to the recreational and the soft bookmakers, they are not going to limit them. So as the sharp customers will be betting those lines and betting those odds, the bookmaker will change the lines, change the odds to reflect what they think is becoming a more realistic, true probability. And so in a sense, a sharp bookmaker will use those the money that's coming from those their customers to make their lines better. They'll also put an awful lot of money into data analysis and data research as well. In contrast, you've got the recreational bookmakers that are more interested in acquiring new customers, more small staking customers, and any of those that show themselves to be reasonably astute at beating their odds will be initially restricted to smaller stakes and then ultimately channeled towards their casino products and then ultimately banned from using the sports products. So that's kind of the different models. One wonders why someone would choose to be a sharp bookmaker when in theory I suppose it's technically easier to be a soft bookmaker, to be a recreational bookmaker. I suppose it's too simplistic a way to look at that. It depends on the jurisdiction you're in. In a location, say, for example, like Europe or particularly the UK, where problem gambling has taken a centre stage in the last few years, and there's been more legislation towards that kind of that area, and there's been more restrictions placed on the activities that bookmakers can indulge in. It's an easier model to engage in, I think, probably the recreational model, and so that's probably why it works. It has worked better traditionally in Europe. I know now that it's spreading more to the Americas and Canada as well. So much to the annoyance of a lot of the customers over there. But they're essentially playing 20 years catch up with the European punters and bookmakers?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely in a very early stage of the legalized betting, at least in the United States, and people are just starting to get an idea of what it is about books cutting them off, and even people that aren't necessarily consider themselves to be sharp will all of a sudden have their limits. They'll be limited down to maybe $20 per bet or something like that. So it kind of drives people crazy. But why would a book do that? Like, why would a book be willing to kind of piss off some of their clients for that set?
The short answer is because the odds that a recreational bookmaker has, they're not very sophisticated and they don't need to be. So whilst maybe less than 1% of customers will be able to beat the lines at a sharp book, it's probably 10 times the number at a recreational book. I mean, and my wisdom of the crowd method is a case in point. It's not a sophisticated method. It's equivalent to line shopping, really. And so the argument goes is that why would a recreational bookmaker need to pay a customer for information that they already hold? They know what the idea is they probably do know what the true odds are. They can just look at Pinnacle, they can look at the Betfair exchange, and they can look at the Asian brand as well. So they kind of know what the true prices should be most of the time. They will then manipulate those in a way that they want to attract smaller staking customers and recreational customers that suit their needs. And they'll do that through like the attractive free bet offers and the bonus offers. If you get the 1 in 20 that comes along and can see how a system of like the wisdom of the Pinnacle crowd will work, it's not very sophisticated, it's not very difficult to implement. The idea is then why would that recreational bookmaker choose to keep that customer on board? They're not giving them any information. So from the perspective of a sharp book, they keep the customers because they're paying for the information that those sharp customers bring. The recreational bookmaker doesn't need to pay for that the information that a line shopper is bringing because they know that information already. They have it. So if you don't need to buy that information, you just get rid of that. And that's kind of the short answer.
The sports book, let's say you are a sharp sports book, you're a Pinnacle. They're taking high limits on these games, but are they taking high limits right away? So for an EPL match or for a National Football League game, are they taking a $50,000 bet right out of the chute when they open up the line? How do they do that?
No, it will grow as more and more turnover comes in. Those limits will start to grow. So initially, where the say for example Pinnacle will open their book, there'll still be some uncertainty about what they've done is correct. So they'll set lower limits. I mean, it's probably I guess it's in the region of 3 to 4 figures for like a lower league match, and probably 4 to 5 figures maybe for a Premier League match. And then that will obviously grow towards the closing time, getting up towards, well, for the really big events, it'll be 5 figures. And then for something like the World Cup final, they might be doing these promotional offers where they say, we'll take stakes of up to $1 million, for example. So no, it's absolutely, those stakes will grow. And for a sharp bettor, I guess often the calculation is not just about how much they can maximize their expected value, but actually how much money they can get down. So you might get more EV in the early stages of a market, but your stake that you can get down is going to be smaller. And obviously you can rebet, but then the Pinnacle will probably lower their odds after your bet. If they think that you're a sharp customer, they're going to lower those odds. So it's kind of a careful calculation is a toss up between the amount of EV you can get and the amount of money you can get down. So yeah.
Yeah, I worked in currency trading, and if you did any size, I mean, certainly in the stock market, anything like that, any traders, if you were doing any sort of size, it kind of reminds me of that, where you didn't want to show your entire hand right away sometimes, right? So you wanted to kind of just through the course of the day, might even be if it's a really large trade over the course of a week, get into that trade, because you don't want to just go ahead and buy $10 million worth of this stock right away. You wanted to kind of ease it into the market and let the market absorb it so that you're not just fluctuating the price right away.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, obviously the timescale for a sports bet is obviously much narrower than for a financial trade, but I guess there are similarities there, yeah, for sure.
Hey, Better Thinking listeners, are you ready to take your sports betting game to the next level? Don't miss out on the Sharp app, the ultimate tool for smarter betting decisions. With expert insights, real-time data, and strategies that give you the edge, the Sharp app is a game changer. And here's the kicker. For a limited time, you can get 35% off your pro subscription with the code THINKING35. That's THINKING 35. Don't be the one left behind while everyone else is cashing in. Download the Sharp app today at sharp.app and start betting smarter. I talk to a lot of younger people now who are just getting in, and they don't necessarily have as much background in it, and they're kind of diving in. They don't necessarily have the they don't totally understand exactly how the lines are made, what value is, anything like that. As an example, I had someone the other day ask me what I thought about the Thursday night game, and it was the Green Bay Detroit game, and I said, well, I like Green Bay getting 3.5, and this is someone who has been betting $1,000 a game, and asked me what plus 3.5 was. So right. I said, okay, you should not be betting until you actually know exactly what it is you're doing. So that's our hope with the Sharp app and this podcast.
Unless he's just betting recreationally and betting for fun, which is of course in Europe and particularly in the UK, there are pains. The government and the regulatory bodies are at pains to say to customers, this is not a way to make money, and it should be considered a form of entertainment. And of course, those that have come from especially the American background, where it's more considered like a game of wits and a game of skill, which it is. I mean, but that's kind of an affront to their psychology, isn't it? And I completely understand that. But obviously, with the worries about gambling addiction and problem gambling here, that it's the whole culture now is shifted towards trying to encourage people to see this just as a form of entertainment that is, and one shouldn't be risking more than they can afford. So it's
I think that
thing for the American customers it's going to take time for them to get their head around this stuff.
There's no doubt, and I do think for maybe 95, maybe 99% of the people out there, it really should be taken as a recreation. But I think you also, if you're going to partake in it, you should have some idea of what you're doing. You should still have sound bankroll management, risk management behind what you're doing, so that you don't get yourself in trouble. Because even if you have the best intentions, psychology, which you talk about quite a bit, does play a role. And I've seen it in trading, and I've certainly seen it in betting. The psychology of, when you losing seems to mentally it changes your brain differently than winning. So in other words, losing $100 bet is more devastating than actually winning $100. You'll hear it with coaches in all sports where, when they finally just retire, they hang it up and they say, you know what, the losses were getting to me far too much, and were weighing on me way more than the wins felt good.
This is just classic loss aversion, the cognitive bias of loss aversion, which Danny Kahneman talks about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Sadly, he's now passed away. But this is classic loss aversion, where it's considered that the pain of a loss is kind of 2 to 3 times greater in magnitude than the joy of a win. And it's classic evolutionary science, really. It's just we're primed to be more fearful. I mean, they're losing in life is potentially more threatening in terms of survival than winning. So it's just standard psychology.
It is, and I always equated it to, when I looked at it evolutionary as well. If you had something, we kind of take for granted what we have nowadays, where we could just go to the supermarket and get some milk and some eggs, and like if we're hungry, there's a million places open all the time for us to eat. When it wasn't that long ago, and relatives that you knew personally who lived in a totally different time, and I kind of figure that when you had something, when you actually had the resource, it was much harder for you to give that resource up. So I think that was built into us. That's just, we really had to accumulate resources, accumulate food, and all the things that we needed to survive. And once you had them, the feeling of giving it up was going to be difficult. It was meant to be painful for you to give it up, because you wouldn't survive if you did.
Absolutely. It's competition of limited resources, isn't it? So there's always, all living organisms, they're competing for a finite amount of resources. So there's always going to be that competition. So exactly, it's just a survival mechanism. One thing I'd say about biases surrounding winning, you're completely right about losses, but I would say that probably for me, one of the most significantly dangerous cognitive biases associated with winning, is that when, especially early days, when a bettor is winning, there's a significant potential to encourage them to believe that they're better than they actually are. And of course, if that happens, and it happens so regularly, and I've seen it so many times over the years, it ultimately means that in the end, in the long run, they can end up losing more than they should have done, because they might up their stakes, or they're betting on things that have got maybe a bigger vig in the market, for example, and they'll end up losing more than they should because they believe that they actually knew how to beat the odds. And for the majority of people, they don't. And even if they do, even if there are some that do more than I may have thought initially, the problem then remains that you're still competing against those that are still better than you, and you're also competing against the bookmaker's margin. So yeah, even if you might have some degree of skill, the cost of playing in these games is, for the majority of people, the vast majority of people, it will see them to become loss-making in the long run. And of course, you don't necessarily see that in your first 10, 20, 30 bets, or even hundreds, even many hundreds. And you may believe that you are better than you actually are. And that's the danger with gambling, really.
Yeah, well, you said something interesting where you're competing against people who are better than you, and inevitably there's going to be very few people who are better than the entire market. I don't think a lot of people understand that point that you just made, which is that you're actually competing against a market and not necessarily the sports book. You hear it all the time, certainly in the United States, where Vegas knows. Oh, they knew. Like, Vegas put that line on there because they're smarter than everybody else. Now, they may be smarter than most people, but what were you talking about there where you're competing against other people?
Well, particularly like at a brand like Pinnacle, you're not just competing against their very smart odds compilers. You're competing against their very, very sharp customers, because they're not being restricted. So they're using those customers, the ones that Pinnacle knows of potentially are the smartest of them, and at setting or knowing what the true prices are. You're essentially competing against them. So if you back a price that's listed by Pinnacle, you're not just betting against their odds compilers. You're betting against all of those that have potentially bet the other side. And you have to then think, am I actually really, really better than all those sharp customers? Or is it just an illusion? If I win a few bets, is it just illusory that I think I'm better than them all? And that's your problem. And essentially it's really like a game of poker, more than anything else, so certainly more than a game of casino, because you're competing against all of the money that's already down on the table. And potentially you're being asked, do you think you've got better information than all that money that's come down on the table on the other side? And that's the challenge, isn't it? And it's not an easy game to beat, because of the nature of the business.
That kind of ties into kind of bringing it back to the wisdom of the crowds now that you're talking about, right? So, and you said it's more of a wisdom of Pinnacle.
Yeah.
And so get back to kind of explaining.
Well, that's exactly why I kind of dreamt up this idea. I was thinking, look, is there a simple way just to find what the true odds are? And I figured Pinnacle, we know, has some of the sharpest prices because they allow the sharpest customers to bet there. And so it's a case of using that as a benchmark for a true probability, and then looking at other bookmakers and seeing do they have longer prices, and where they do, that's where you've got your expected value. Now, of course, the bookmakers where you can find that will invariably be the recreational ones, the soft ones. If they can see you're doing that, then they will very, very quickly limit you and ban you. So what I often say to people is that your challenge is not necessarily finding the expected value and actually beating the odds. That's pretty easy to do. Your challenge is going to be hiding yourself and disguising yourself so that they can't see what you're doing. And that I don't provide too much information about that, but others can do that for me. I mean, it's things like putting them into multiples, ACCAs and that sort of thing, maybe throwing them in, not necessarily always taking the highest prices if they're highest in the market, trying to just take them when they're not quite so high. Throwing in the odd kind of mug bet, like a goal scorer bet, or having the odd casino play, and it's just disguising what you do to make it work and to prolong the lifetime of your betting account.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty sharp people where they found some mispricing at some of these books that you're talking about on certain props, and what they were doing is basically putting them in these massive parlays that would never win. But when they did, they took them. Now they needed a large bankroll to do this. They were kind of round robin, putting in round robin bets. I don't know what the right verb is for round robining, I guess, but they were putting them in round robins and parlays in these massive parlays. And when it did hit, they took the book for quite a bit, and then the book adjusted, and I actually spoke to one of the books that this happened to, and they said, yeah, well, it's kind of the price of doing business. Like, we put so many bets out there that there's so many sharp people out there. Someone's going to get us. We'll pay it, and we'll learn from it, and we'll we'll tighten it up.
Certainly, I mean, in the UK, betting parlays and accumulators, it's you're signaling to the bookmaker that you're a mug and you're either recreational or you don't know what you're doing. So if you hide your expected value in there, even when you win, you'll win less often because the probabilities of parlays coming in are smaller, obviously. But when you win, it's probably less likely that their algorithms are going to pick you up as someone who might need to be looked at and whether you need to be limited. In the end, they'll probably get you, but
you're hoping you make that one big payday. You're hoping you can get that payday before they do, which is what these guys were able to do. So, back to what you're talking about with like the true odds. So if we look at a Pinnacle, and we could assume that they're going to be as close to the true odds as possible. First of all, just quickly, let's talk about the wisdom of the odds and why that works. And the book where they talk about the ox in the book and how they went to the subject went to the fair and was able to guess the weight of the ox. Let's talk about that for a second, and then get back to how it works in sports betting.
It depends on the market that you're looking at, but you want a system that's potentially unbiased, potentially random in the way that the kind of the guesses are going to come in. So with Galton's, what was it? Galton's, was it Galton's ox? I can't remember specifically what.
I can't remember.
Yeah, and was it to guess the weight? I can't remember.
It was the weight. Correct. It was the weight of the ox.
Yeah, and
at a state fair.
So provided there's no kind of group thing going on, and everyone's has got access to independent information or independent guesswork, and they'll put in their figure. The idea is that the average of all of those figures is going to be pretty close, as it proved to be, to the actual weight. I actually did this once at I think it was at a local fair. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was
flower. I just read your flower petals.
It was petals. Yeah, it was a long time ago, and my memory's not what it was. But and they said there was like an enter for like £1 or something, or $1, well, £1 in the UK, and guess the number of petals in the bowl. And I said, I'm not going to guess. Can you show me the number of all the ones, all the guesses so far? And they'd been puzzled about that. And I'd said, look, I'm just intrigued because I'm writing this chapter at the minute, and I just kind of just like to. I don't really, even if I win this, I won't take the prize, but I just want to see if it works. And it was pretty close. I think, was it about 92% within the actual figure it was in the end, something like that.
Yeah. Well, what happened was, believe there was only 44 numbers, 44 guesses.
Yeah.
So you wound up being 70% off, but then they had more guesses later on, and it got a lot closer as the sample size went up. It got to within 8%.
Yeah. I mean, it won't always work. Where it can fail is if there's a potential for groupthink or some kind of cognitive bias that may influence. But provided everything's kind of random and independent, it's much more likely to be effective. And arguably, that's the case with like a sharp book like Pinnacle. So long as you've got enough sharp customers that are providing their information, then ultimately I think you can probably say there's a reasonable chance that the odds that it's going to settle at, particularly at closing, will be pretty close to what you'd assume would be the true probability. You can obviously never know what the true probability is, but kind of in a philosophical sense, you say the true probability in quotation marks. And it proves to be, as all the data analysis that I've done, it proved to be the case. I've broken this down, like hundreds of thousands of bits of data points for soccer, 1x2 odds, the actual what you call money line, and breaking it down into 1% increments. So the odds that imply 99% win and 98% win, 97% win, and so on and so forth. And then you plot those little subsamples against the actual times, the percentage times that you actually get the win. and it's pretty close to a 1-to-1 correlation. So where the odds suggest, well, once you've devigged it, where they say it's a 58% chance that it should win, those prices tend to win pretty close to 58% of the time. I mean, obviously there is some variance, but then you do your statistical analysis, draw a correlation, and it's pretty close to 1-to-1.
I like to use a Breyer score to figure out, like, have you ever read the book Super Forecasting?
I haven't actually. I've come across it, but I've not read it.
Yeah, good book, and I learned a little bit about Breyer scores and forecasting, and that's how I'll when I'm looking at something like that, because with the market, basically the way you're going to put, they brought all these forecasters in, and these were people who were experts to housewives to people who from all different walks of life, and they just gave them these events, and some events that what are the chances that a war is going to break out in some region or something like that, and put a probability score on it. So it works well with sports betting, because obviously we've got the implied odds, and there's our built-in probability, and then we could compare that. If I'm building a model, I want to compare it. Is my model just basically as good as the sports betting market, or is my score higher? And of course, you've got to do that over a large sample before you're confident in what it is that you're doing. But you mentioned a Vigless line, and I think that's really important. And you mentioned a few different ways. Now, I think the simplest way, and certainly in a two-way market, it's even more simple, is to take that midpoint. But there's some downside to just taking a midpoint between the money lines. And what is that?
If you assume that the margin is distributed equally on each side, that works. That's fine for something, say, like point spread or Asian handicap or goal line, where it's kind of close to 50-50. So it's not going to be an issue. But for something like the fixed odds in soccer, and particularly in tennis, where you can get some real strong favorites and underdogs, what happens, for whatever reason it is, and there's so many papers have been written about this in the academic literature as to why this bias exists. But what the reality is that there is more margin placed on the underdog than there is on the favorite. So for a very skewed market, so for example, say Djokovic is, I don't know, playing the ranked 100 player in the world, he might be 1.05. That's in European notation. I don't know what that would be, minus 2,000 in American
correct
notation. Yeah. And on the other side, it would be something like, a DVIG market, if it was 1.05, it would be about 20, wouldn't it, in decimal? What you find is that if you spread that margin evenly, you might go to 1.03 and 17, but that's not what you see the bookmakers do. You're more likely to see something like 1.047 and then something like 12. And so what's happened is that the margin is a much bigger shortening on the underdog, so a much bigger margin has been applied. Now, of course, we don't know what the DVIG odds are because the bookmakers won't tell us, but when you kind of retrofit backwards in terms of the results that you've seen and the percentages of the outcomes, you realize that far more margin has been applied to the underdog, and so that's just the reality of so when you then want to devig something to try and find out what the true prices are, if you don't take that bias into account, it's called favorite long shot bias. If you don't take it into account, you're going to end up with some markedly incorrect values of what you think are the true odds. And so that's why it's important to do it.
Yeah, I did not realize that. So that's really interesting. And I do a little bit of tennis and soccer. I call it soccer, of course. But yes, those are the markets where you will see those big, those large lines, the minus 2,000s, as we say here in the U.S., American odds. And as you were speaking, it kind of, I would guess, because typically no one's betting that minus 2,000 side. Some more people may take $1 or $2 or, a quid or two and put it on the big underdog. I'm guessing that's what they found.
That's another one of Kahneman's cognitive biases. It's the desire for the big win. It's kind of like playing the lottery ticket, isn't it? It's life-changing obviously 20-1 is not life-changing, but you get the picture. People are more attracted to, I do it. I really only bet recreationally, to be fair, these days. So And I can't remember the last. I seem to win for everyone else when people ask for me for some advice. What's who's going to win the World Cup, who's going to win the Euros, and so on. And I seem to get all those right because they're usually shorter prices. But when I do my own stuff, it's like, let's go for 10, 20, 30 to 1 just for the fun of it. And I just can't remember the last time I won any of those. But so yeah, I do it. So it's what people are drawn to. So and again, going back to the kind of the harmful gambling topic as well. If someone came to me and said, look, I want to be good at betting, but I'm also scared that I might, I end up betting too much and I want to minimize my losses. So what I would say to them is, okay, two things. Bet at an exchange where the prices, or bet in liquid markets at an exchange where the prices are pretty close to 100%, and bet short prices. And just bet flat stakes. And then over your time, you will probably, you could make your career last many, many, many years, and you would gradually, slowly lose a bit of money, but you'd have a lot of entertainment along the way. And that's, for safer gambling, that's the sort of thing I would advise. Back favourites. Back favourite as an exchange. And you won't win, but you will have a lot of fun. And if people are looking for recreation, then that's and it's brought up for, I guess, Mel, the trouble is recreational betting is people are drawn to the underdogs. But that's why you probably shouldn't, because there's more margin in them, so you're going to lose more quickly betting them, especially at a bookmaker. You will then win a lot or lose a lot more quickly, always backing on underdogs, and that's the problem.
Well, I find, certainly if you're a recreational bettor, if you're using proper money management, the way I'll bet an underdog is I'm always trying to win one unit, so that if I am betting a 20 to 1 shot, I'm really only betting, if my unit size is $100, I'm only betting $5 on there, because that's going to be able to
so you're doing like a unit win money
unit
management.
To win,
yeah.
Right? And that's what I try to tell people to do. But like you said, nobody bets a 20 to 1 shot to win $100 if they're a $100 bettor. They bet $100 in the hopes of winning $2,000 on that bet. And often this kind of goes into hedging. I don't know what your opinion is on that. I'll get the question on hedging often, and usually it's about futures, right? So typically here in the States, it's going to be someone picks a team to win the NFL, to win the Super Bowl, or to win the World Series, or something of that sort, and they stand to win, let's say $10,000 if their team comes in and wins. Or actually, what happened more often these days is now they'll play a parlay of 5, 6, 7 teams, 8 teams over the weekend. And of course, we've got Monday Night Football here in the United States, and that would be the last game of the leg of the parlay. They've hit their 6. The 7th game is the parlay, and they want to hedge or arb out of that last bet. And my thing is always, well, why did you make the bet in the first place? Like, you must have had a reason for betting this team that plays on Monday night, thinking that they were going to win. You could have just played the six teams in the parlay, and you would have won already. But certainly, of course, they would have been looking to hedge out there. Everyone, because it's that it's the feeling that I want to win. It kind of goes back to that psychology again, where it's here, it's tangible now. I'm this close, so it's all or nothing on this one game. I don't want to risk all or nothing on this one game. I just want to take something, and I'll feel good. They're like, I feel good about it. But if you are doing what I said, where if you're betting to win one unit, it wouldn't even be a thought. You're like, well, I don't care. Like, I'm just going to try to win one unit. I'm sure you've seen some logic like this and thinking like this.
I traditionally was always of the view your maximum EV will be the bet you placed. And if you do any kind of hedging or what you call cash out, for example, at the Betfair exchange, you're giving up some of that EV. And so I was always of the view the bookmakers only offer such a tool or a gimmick because it's a way of making money. And then along comes Dan Abrams. I'm hoping you know of him, and I'm hoping you're going to have him on your lineup. And he's just written a book. I think it's called "How Much Did You Lose?" or "How Much Did You Lose?" I think it is. And he asked me to review it, and it was one hell of a book. Excuse my language. It took me. I'm still struggling to even think, did I understand half of it? And I would probably have to reread it 2 or 3 times to get my head completely around it. But for me, for a really, really aspiring sharp bettor, it takes you through all of the mathematical logic as to why things like hedging or cashing out and so on, even at prices that are potentially and lines that are potentially negative expected value, actually makes mathematical sense from the perspective of it's not just about maximizing your EV, it's about maximizing your expected bankroll growth. And for a sharp bettor, there's a significantly sound argument that that's what you should be focused on. Certainly in the world of finance, that's kind of you're using these kind of Kelly criteria staking plans to maximize your bankroll growth and not necessarily your EV. I'm still struggling to get my head around it. I think for a less sophisticated bettor, it may be too much, first of all, to implement, and secondly, whether it's the right thing for them anyway, and particularly in markets like the UK where you face all sorts of restrictions and so on and so forth, whether it's going to be suitable. But maybe at sharp books, at exchanges where there's significant enough liquidity, and maybe at the Asian brands as well, it kind of, he won me round into thinking, well, actually, it doesn't even matter if you hedge at negative expected, because here's the maths that's saying this is what you should be doing. I'm less familiar with that world, and having read Dan's book, I still feel like I'm very unfamiliar with that world, but he makes the case, contrary to what I always thought, which is actually hedging at inferior prices can be a really, really good idea. And the main reason why you do this is to lower your variance, because it's not just about EV, it's about getting the variance down. And of course, by definition, an arbitrage it's arbitrage where you can win a small amount no matter what the result is very, very minimal or zero variance, essentially, because it's a sure win. But like a hedge where you can still potentially lose on one side, you're essentially turning, if you redo the maths for the whole bet that you've placed, it makes it a very, very high probability of winning some money. And so by reducing the odds and maximizing the probability of positive outcome, that's essentially reducing your variance. The shorter the odds, the better, the smaller the variance. It's just standard law of probability. And so that's the reason why you would choose to do this.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I'm gonna have to get that. I understand that from a professional standpoint, you're right, where you do want to reduce variance, but I think I think it probably matters on bet sizing here. It goes back to that, where if you're sizing correctly with your bets, it may not be as big, right? So the whole point of having a unit size and having and doing it the way I like to do, which is to win a unit, it takes that into account. It takes the variance into account, because the old statistical professor, there's the old saying, I don't know if any statistical stats professors actually did this, but you've read the stories in books where they say this, a professor will tell the entire class to go home, flip a coin 500 times, and write down all of the outcomes. And then inevitably the professor can look at everyone's paper and know who actually flipped the coin 500 times and who just sat down and wrote heads, tails, tails, heads, right? Because the average person doesn't understand, they don't understand the variance. They don't understand the amount of times in a 50-50 proposition that you can flip heads 15 times in a row, and that's not abnormal if you've got a 500, 1,000. Matter of fact, there's and I forget the formula, you probably know, and what it's called, where we can actually calculate how many times we should be able to throw a head, in or tail in the same one in a row.
There's actually a test to determine the likelihood of whether it's a real sequence. I think it's called the Wald or Wolfowitz test, which I've used to determine whether certain tipsters are actually creating fake sequences of their bets. And actually in the book, I think it was I can't remember if it was in Monte Carlo or whether it was in Squares and Sharp, but it was in one of them. And I actually tried this myself. I thought, okay, let's see how easy it is to create a random sequence of coin tosses, just 20 tosses. And I did it multiple times. I think I did it 10 times. And in, I think, 4 of the occasions where I did this, and then I did a stats test on it, it was smaller than a 1 in 100 chance that it could have happened randomly. So even though I was trying to make a random sequence, I failed miserably on 4 out of those 10 occasions. And that was someone that knows about sequences and knows how to, we often, when we try and do it, we end up with too many short sequences and not enough long sequences, because we think the long sequences are systematic or a sign of a pattern or something causal, and what we're trying to do is create something random, and we underestimate how long some of those sequences can be that can happen purely randomly. So even I'm aware of that, I still fail to do it on multiple occasions.
Yeah, it's funny. I've never tried it, and I always said, if that ever happened to me, I'd be able to game it because I would know.
Have a try. I mean, that's what I did. I did.
I would like to do that now.
And then I plugged it into the Wolfowitz test. Yeah, and 4 out of the 10 occasions, it was a p-value of around about 0.01. And it was like, oh my God, really? Have I really been that bad at it, even though I know what I'm doing?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. But this is the reason when you go to a casino that they have that they started to show you all the past numbers on the roulette wheel, right? Because people are going to inevitably go there and they're going to say, boy, black has come out 7 times in a row, 8 times in a row. Now, 2 people will look at that differently. One person will say, boy, black is really hot right now. I'm going to go put £100, $100 on black. The same exact wheel, someone's going to come over and say, boy, black's hit 7, 8 times in a row. I'm going to go play the red because red is due.
Gambler's fallacy.
I've heard fairly I've heard reasonably intelligent people logically, think that they're logically thinking this through, and that somehow this works.
I'll hold my hands up and say, I'll admit this. I think the early days of the national lottery in our country here, I used to play it. I mean, I only played it a few weeks because I know it's a complete it's just a stupid, like the zig on it is ridiculous. So I gave up in the end. So I'm not really interested in the big win. I mean, obviously we'd love it, but I'm not prepared to have like a margin of whatever it is, 200-300% that they're playing against me. But in the early days of when I was mucking about with it, I came across this website online that was saying there's this thing called hot and cold numbers. And I thought, I'm going to have to just buy that little thing just to see what it says. And you can, and then I actually started playing the system for a few weeks, and then I just I talked myself into believing that this thing might be something that I've never heard of, and it might have something real in it. And of course, I was being fooled. It's just total nonsense. And this is all completely random. The lottery balls come out completely random. I mean, unless you believe in conspiracies, which I don't. But even I decided that I would actually have a look at such a thing to see if there was anything in it, which is like, it makes me think what a doofus that I was.
No, listen, I've done the same thing when I was a kid. I remember reading a book where they're like, you could give yourself an edge on the lottery if at the time it was pick, 5 numbers or 6 numbers, whatever it was. Let's say it was 6 numbers, if you take 7 or 8 numbers and then basically play every combination of those numbers, you're giving yourself a better chance of winning. Now, someone who, I was young, I was in college and I was pretty good at math. I actually tried it. Now, it didn't take me long to realize that all you're doing is it's the same combination. If you pick, whatever the combination of numbers are for 7 or 8 numbers and then playing them in every combination, if you played all those combinations with random numbers, your odds are exactly the same to win. But these are psychological games and tricks that are played on people and really that's what, listen, they built casinos with every little thing in mind, from the temperature to the smells to the colors, in order to entice people to play. And they've done this. There's a science behind it. So everything that they do, everything that's in that casino was put in there for a reason, and that is to entice you to play.
50-50 games are the most interesting games. So things like, black, red at roulette and the odd even, those sorts of things. And obviously some of the craps probabilities, they work out at kind of around about 50-50, depending on how you're playing it. And even some of the blackjack is, a lot of these things are 50-50. And it's like in Asian handicap and also point spread in sports. They're designed they're intentionally 50-50. And there's a really, really good YouTube video by he's a cognitive psychologist or neuropsychologist called Robert Sapolsky. I think he's an American, and it's a really, really good video where it's about 5 minutes long, and he shows some research he's done with monkeys and the levels of dopamine. And dopamine is obviously like the anticipatory feel-good hormone that we have, or neurotransmitter. And so it's when we're all like, say, if we're anticipating, we see a fruit or we're looking for a fruit, low hanging fruit on the tree, and our dopamine is spiking, and then we see it and it will spike some more, and then when we get it, it'll spike a little bit more, but not quite as much as it has when we first anticipated the reward. So it's kind of it's the neurotransmitter for the anticipation of a reward. And then he did some further research about when he made the guarantee of the reward less than 100%. And what he found was when there was no chance of getting a reward, the dopamine was pretty minimal. And when it was 100% chance, it was, again, not so big. And the way to maximize the dopamine spikes, or the transmitter that's regulating and anticipation, was when it's 50-50. And that is the nature of so many games in casino and also sports betting markets. And they're intentionally designed that. Whether, of course, I mean, obviously the bookmakers and the casinos didn't know the neuroscience behind this, but they could obviously see that what their customers were attracted to. And the reason that they're attracted to those games is because they have 50-50 outcomes. And that's when you get the maximum spike in the neurotransmitter called dopamine. So we're really, in terms of addiction, whether it's gambling or anything else, we are actually all addicted to dopamine and not the games themselves. The games are they're just a means to an end, but we just love the dopamine.
Yeah, it's just there's different ways to achieve it, and I guess with different sports or just different outlets, right? So, but the 50-50 is interesting. I had not heard that, and it may go back to what we were talking about previously, because you will inevitably, if you have no edge, and you're playing the NBA, things that have a point spread attached to it are essentially 50-50 propositions. If you have no edge, playing against the spread. So the spread, which gives basically handicaps the game and makes it even no matter which two sides are playing against each other, there's a 50-50 chance that either one of those sides, the underdog or the favorite, is going to win. I think that you're right. It kind of plays into that, because no matter how good or bad you are, going back to the coin flip analogy, you're going to win 10, 15. If you play long enough, you're going to win like 10 or 15 games in a row. Uh-huh. And you're always going to remember that time that you went on that 10 or 15 game losing. Now, you're also going to lose 10 or 15 games in a row, right? It's just inevitable if you don't have an edge. And even if you did have an edge of, let's say you could pick 50-50 propositions 55% of the time, you're still going to have those runs where you're going to it's just inevitable. I don't care what your edge is. You're going to have those long losing runs as well as long winning runs. But I think that it potentially keeps it in your head where it keeps you coming back. It's the thing in golf where on the 18th hole, you play terrible 17 holes, you play a good 18th hole, and that's what keeps you coming back. I think it's the same thing in sports. When it's 50-50, if you were consistently just playing huge long shots and you just never won, I think at some point you'd probably stop playing. I think for a lot, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I think that 50-50 keeps you back.
That is exactly what the neuroscience says. It's win enough, but not too much. So it's the anticipation. It's the addiction of maybe. We are addicted to the anticipation of a reward, and it's maximized when it's 50%. It's funny enough, when you were talking about that sequences of losses, is actually maybe reminded me of something in the book on Monte Carlo, which the difference between a sharp and a square punter in terms of the probability of losing sequences and winning sequence for that matter as well is really, really marginal. It's surprising how little the difference is. There's a chart in somewhere in the book that's just to show you the probability of a sharp getting whatever it was, 5, 6, 7, 8 losses in a row, and betting at even money or betting at whatever odds it was in the chart. And it's amazingly small, the difference between the two. And I suppose, again, it's another reason why people who do have some winning sequences then overestimate their chance of actually thinking that they're skilled when they may not be. Because the difference between a square and a sharp in terms of actual sequences of outcomes is very, very marginal. And it's another way of saying that the variance in things like casino and sports betting and poker or any of these games is huge. And because you will only start to see the difference between a sharp and a square after many, many hundreds and thousands of plays. I mean, for example, Nate Silver in his book, wasn't it, The Signal and the Noise, I think it was, he said did he say it was actually happened to him? He played 2 years and maybe 30, 40,000 plays in poker and was still down, even though he would consider himself, and probably others would consider himself, to be a pretty decent player. And he played semi-professionally, didn't he, I think, or professionally. And you could, in theory, be down. And like my own wisdom of the crowd, the record that I've shown, it's had sequences of thousands and thousands of bets that are actually on a drawdown before it recovers over time. So the question is, are you prepared as a bettor to be able to last those losing runs, or are you going to start going full tilt and chasing losses and so on, which is, of course, is the worst thing you can do. The hardest career that you can choose. People think I'll take up betting because it's an easy way to make money. I can give up my day job, and if I get really, really good at it, I can make a career out of it. It's a few people can do that, but it's the hardest way to make a living. Absolutely no doubt.
I've said it a million. It's the toughest way to make an easy living.
It really is, yeah.
By far, and it's
maybe
gotten tougher.
One of the most enjoyable and fun ways to do it, but that's not the same thing as easy.
There's no doubt about that. But I think there's the allure of being able to just kind of sit by yourself at a computer and plug away. It's the same mentality. It's the poker mentality of the online poker, where I don't have to physically go out there. I could play poker online. I could day trade. They all sort of DFS, which I've done professionally, which is the daily fantasy sports. And the interesting thing there, when you have poker and daily fantasy sports, is you do get to meet in person your competition. If you're a poker player, you're going to go to these tournaments and you're going to meet people in person. You're going to meet the daily fantasy sports players when you go to these live finals. Inevitably, I meet the same people over and over again. And what you'll find is these are super intelligent people. A lot of times they're a little socially awkward. They're not necessarily people who would do or would thrive well in corporate America, because they're not political. They're not people who are going to be able to, they're extremely bright, but they're not going to succeed by, schmoozing people and moving up the corporate ladder. So I think they found their niche in these type of activities. But it's also something, it's very hard to have a family when you're taking these kind of risks and you don't have a good foundation, or at least if your partner is not out there, maybe at least providing a little bit more stability in your life. Because of variance, it's going to be up or down. The greatest poker player in the world, the greatest sports bettor in the world, they're going to go through some really bad times.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think Pinnacle, they actually wrote one of their educational articles. They said one of a good trait to have would be, like, if you're an actuary, there's some kind of crossover skills. If you're an actuary or an accountant, you could make it as a sports bettor, because there's kind of skills where you can detach emotionally from the numbers and the probabilities and that sort of thing.
I heard someone, I don't know if it was CNBC, this is a long time ago, and it was a psychologist, and she had written a book, and she said, when they studied traders, the most successful traders, that one of the traits that they found was they almost had a sociopathic mindset. In other words, they were able to disconnect from what it was. The money wasn't necessarily what drove them, right? So they were able to separate emotionally from that, and that seems to be the mindset that you need to have. You don't need to be a sociopath, but you need to somehow be able to just kind of strictly play it. If you are going to be a professional, the wins and losses. I know a lot of professionals who don't even watch the games because they just don't want to get caught up in the emotion. To them, the work was done when they were building their models and they were placing their bets and getting the money down. That's a whole different aspect, as we kind of alluded to. Just getting the money down is part of the game. The bets themselves, Saturday and Sunday during college football, during the EPL or whatever it is, they don't even want to watch the game. Like, that's their time that they're going to relax a little bit. They put their work in on Monday through Friday to get to that point. So I always thought that was interesting, is to try to train yourself and it's easier said than done to kind of detach yourself from the money, because you never want to get too low and you never want to get too high, because I think that leads to bad decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, when you were saying all that, you're talking about whether you need to have some kind of psychopathic trait. I wonder whether it's not necessarily psychopathic or sociopathic, but I wonder if there's a greater propensity of successful sports bettors that might also be found to be on the autistic spectrum line. So I don't know of any study that's been done, but it would be something that would be really, really interesting, because I guess, I probably somewhere on the spectrum, and I know of others who follow on Twitter that almost or have declared that they are, and probably are as well. And I just wonder whether that it's kind of the mindset that it disposes itself to being a more successful bettor, because you're more focused on the actual mathematics and less on the emotions of the gameplay and the outcomes. And it may be that it'd be a great study to do. I don't know if it's been done, but it would be really quite a fascinating thing for someone to do. I mean, in fact, to be honest, even me saying that it'd be fascinating probably gives the game away that I'm probably on the spectrum by thinking that this is it. Yeah.
No, I mean, strictly from an anecdotal standpoint, and someone who's played a lot of poker, and then like I said, in the DFS world, I think that's 100% accurate from my experience. Because like I said, these are typically, they're people who just aren't necessarily social creatures, where, on Wall Street, you have a couple of different types, right? So you've got more of the salesy people who may be super intelligent, but they're the ones taking the clients out. They're going out there and they're schmoozing. They're getting the money. They're getting the clients on board. They're getting the investment. And then you've got these quants, or you've got, the guys that are working, but, nowadays everybody shows up to work in sneakers and jeans. But back, 20 years ago, that wasn't the norm. And these big hedge funds would just hire these quant guys. And that's what these guys want to do. They're basically programmers, the same kind of mindset. And you're right. I think the study would be fascinating as far as what those people, why are they successful? Are people who are on the spectrum, and maybe to what degree that they are on the spectrum, do they does that lead to success? Because I do think there's something to that, where you can kind of disassociate yourself from and just be laser focused on the data.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's also true to say that the vast majority of people who do bet are male. Now, traditionally, it's been assumed that there's a greater disposition of males to autistic spectrum disorder. I hate calling it disorder because I don't think it is a disorder, but that's the terminology. I know more recently that people now say that it's that women potentially are just as likely to be ASD. It's just that they are better at masking and disguising it, and the tests that we use to try and uncover it are not sophisticated enough to get round of that. Whether any of that's valid and true, I don't know, but it's certainly true to say that the vast majority of people who bet are males. Now, whether that's got anything to do with the males are more attracted to this kind of skill-based work and trying to beat the system, and they're more competitive and so on. I mean, obviously they've got more testosterone and so on. So, which is interesting in itself in the financial setting. It was a study, wasn't there, was done. Women make better decisions, or they lose less money than men because they just have less testosterone and they're more risk averse, and they make the fewer stupid decisions.
Right. But it's also, it winds up being a bell curve, right? So the stupid decisions fall into two categories, right? So it's the reason that you'll see more men do take more risk, as you said. But when you take more risk, you've got the opportunity to find yourself multiple standard deviations on both sides of that bell curve. So there's going to be a lot of really bad, you're going to be some bad situations, but people who've made these unbelievably successes, the Elon Musks of the world, have taken risks as well, and then they're on the other side. So that's what's going to happen, right, for people. So it's a topic we could get into at another time. It is fascinating. There are some differences, not so much in the middle between men and women, but I think on the extremes, those who are willing to take the extreme risk tend to be mostly male, and that could play into it, as you said, where in the middle, we're all probably pretty close, men and women, if we look in between, one standard deviation on either side.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listen, it's been fascinating. I don't want to keep you away any longer. I really, really appreciate you coming on and the information that you were able to give to our listeners and our viewers. And I hope to have you on some more, because I think we got a lot more topics to discuss. It was fascinating, Joseph.
Grant. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this content.